I didn't swallow my words because I didn't have them. I swallowed them because I knew exactly what they would cause. There was always that brief moment before speaking, when I could already feel the shift, the tension entering the room, the calm cracking, the fragile balance starting to tilt. In those moments, peace felt more urgent than honesty. So I chose restraint. Not loudly, not dramatically. Just quietly enough to keep everything looking the same. At first, it felt like maturity, like emotional intelligence. I told myself that knowing when to stay quiet was a strength, that not every truth needed to be spoken out loud. I learned how to soften reactions before they reached my voice, how to nod instead of respond, how to let discomfort pass without naming it. Each time I did, the room stayed calm. And each time, I felt a small, almost invisible part of myself step back. What I didn't notice was how often peace depended on my silence. How frequently harmony was maintained not because things were resolved, but because I chose not to disturb them. I became skilled at reading the atmosphere, sensing when honesty would feel like disruption. So I adjusted. I minimized. I swallowed words that mattered because keeping things smooth felt safer than risking friction. There were moments when the words pressed hard against my chest, waiting for space. Moments when staying quiet took effort. Not because I was angry, but because something inside me needed acknowledgement. I would ask myself whether it was worth it, worth the shift in tone, worth the possibility of being misunderstood, worth the risk of being seen as difficult instead of accommodating. Most of the time, the answer was no. Only later did I begin to sense what that choice was costing me, not in obvious ways, not in arguments or fallout, but in the gradual realization that peace, when it matters more than you do, isn't neutral. It asks you to disappear slowly. And standing there, surrounded by calm, I didn't yet understand how much of myself I had been trading away, only that something essential had gone quiet long before I did. I used to believe that keeping the peace was a form of care, that choosing calm over confrontation made me considerate, emotionally aware, evolved. I told myself that not every feeling needed expression, that some truths were better left untouched if they threatened the balance of the moment. And for a long time, that belief worked. Things stayed calm. Voices stayed even. Nothing appeared broken on the surface. What I didn't question was why peace always seemed to require my silence, why harmony depended on my ability to absorb discomfort rather than share it. I learned to read rooms quickly, to sense when honesty would feel like disruption instead of relief. So I adapted. I softened my tone before it was needed. I chose timing carefully, or avoided it altogether. Peace became something I maintained, not something we shared. Over time, that responsibility began to feel heavier. Not because I wanted conflict, but because I started noticing what peace was asking of me. It asked me to pause reactions before they could exist, to filter emotions until they felt harmless, to measure my words not by truth, but by how little they would disturb the calm. I wasn't lying. I was editing myself into something easier to live with. There were moments when I felt the weight of what went unsaid more clearly. Small moments. A glance that lingered too long. A comment that landed wrong and stayed there. I would feel the urge to respond, then feel it dissolve as I reminded myself that speaking would complicate things. Silence kept the peace, but it also left something unfinished inside me. What I didn't realize yet was that peace, when it requires erasure, isn't neutral. It reshapes you quietly. It teaches you to prioritize stability over presence, calm over truth. This story isn't about learning how to speak up. It's about recognizing what happens when peace becomes more important than the person maintaining it, and how easily that trade can go unnoticed for far too long. At some point, I stopped noticing when I was choosing silence. It became instinctive, automatic, almost reflexive. A thought would rise, a feeling would surface, and before I could decide what to do with it, it was already contained. I didn't experience my reactions fully anymore. I managed them. Silence wasn't something I weighed carefully each time. It was simply the safest default. What made it difficult to question was how well it seemed to work. Conversations stayed smooth. Tension dissolved before it could take shape. People appeared comfortable around me. I was often described as easygoing, calm, someone who didn't overreact. Each of those descriptions felt like confirmation that I was doing the right thing, that swallowing my words was proof of maturity, rather than avoidance. But beneath that surface calm, something subtle began to shift. I started replaying moments in my head. Not arguments, but pauses. Things I almost said. Reactions I stopped mid-thought. It wasn't regret exactly. It was more like unfinished business quietly following me from one interaction to the next. I noticed how often peace depended on anticipation. I learned to sense discomfort before it arrived and remove myself from its path. I avoided tone changes. I avoided questions that might invite disagreement. I avoided expressing needs that might disrupt the calm I worked so hard to preserve. Silence became a way of staying ahead of conflict by never allowing it to begin. There were moments when I felt strangely invisible, even while being present. I showed up. I listened. I contributed just enough to remain involved without revealing too much. But parts of me stayed hidden, not because they were unimportant, but because they felt incompatible with peace. That invisibility wasn't imposed. It was practiced. What unsettled me most was how easily I accepted it. I told myself that not everything needs to be said, that self-control is a virtue, that emotional restraint is a sign of strength. Those ideas felt responsible, even noble, but they also gave me permission to disappear quietly without naming what was being lost. Silence began to shape my expectations of connection. I stopped expecting to be met halfway. I stopped waiting for curiosity or engagement. I learned how to rely on myself emotionally in ways that felt independent, but also isolating. Peace kept things stable, but it didn't bring me closer to anyone, including myself. There were moments when the silence felt heavier than usual. Not dramatic, not overwhelming, just present enough to notice. A tightness in my chest when something meaningful passed without acknowledgement. A sense that something important had been skipped over in favor of comfort. Those moments didn't demand action, but they left a mark. I began to realize that peace, as I had been practicing it, required constant vigilance. I had to stay alert to my own emotions in order to suppress them in time. That effort was invisible to everyone else, but it accumulated quietly inside me. What looked like calm on the outside was maintained by continuous internal negotiation. I wasn't angry. I wasn't unhappy in obvious ways. That's what made it so difficult to see the cost. I was functioning. I was composed. But somewhere along the way, peace had stopped being something we shared and started being something I carried alone. And without fully acknowledging it yet, I was moving closer to a realization I had been avoiding. That peace maintained through silence is not the same as peace that allows you to exist fully within it. Silence didn't feel like absence at first. It felt like discipline, a practiced ability to pause, to assess, to decide what was worth disturbing the calm for. I told myself this was wisdom, knowing when to let things pass, when to stay measured instead of reactive. But over time, that discipline began to feel less like choice and more like obligation. I noticed how often I adjusted myself before anyone else had to. Before discomfort could surface, I softened it. Before disagreement could form, I redirected it inward. Peace was preserved not because things were resolved, but because I learned how to intercept tension before it became visible. That interception became my responsibility. Quietly, without discussion. There were moments when I sensed how uneven that responsibility was. I watched others speak freely, express irritation, disappointment, even anger, and still be met with patience. Meanwhile, my own restraint was taken as normal, expected. No one asked me to be quieter. I had simply learned that silence kept everything easier for everyone else. What troubled me wasn't that I avoided conflict. It was how conflict avoidance slowly turned into self-avoidance. I stopped trusting my reactions enough to give them space. I evaluated feelings by how disruptive they might be, rather than how true they were. Peace had become the lens through which I measured my right to exist emotionally. I could feel the distance growing, not outwardly, but internally. I was present in conversations, attentive and responsive, yet somehow removed from my own experience. Silence allowed me to remain composed, but it also asked me to step back from myself, to observe rather than inhabit what I felt. There were times when the quiet felt almost protective. It spared me from tension, from misinterpretation, from the vulnerability of being misunderstood. But that protection came with a cost, the slow erosion of immediacy. Reactions dulled. Responses became calculated. I no longer trusted the first impulse, only the edited version that felt safe enough to release. I began to realize how much effort it took to maintain that calm exterior. It required constant awareness, constant filtering. I had to be attentive not only to others, but to my own internal signals, stopping them before they crossed an invisible line. That vigilance was exhausting in ways I hadn't allowed myself to acknowledge. What made it harder was how invisible the exhaustion felt. I wasn't overwhelmed. I wasn't breaking down. I was functioning well. But something essential felt muted, as if my emotional range had narrowed without my consent. Peace had kept everything stable and quietly limited. Occasionally, I felt the urge to disrupt that calm, to speak without measuring the outcome, to let a reaction exist without reshaping it first. Those urges surfaced briefly, then disappeared under the familiar logic of restraint. Silence had trained me to doubt the legitimacy of my own impulses. The longer I stayed in that pattern, the harder it became to imagine stepping out of it. Words felt heavier. Honesty felt risky. Peace, once a shared state, had turned into something I maintained alone. And I was starting to sense that this version of peace wasn't neutral anymore. It was quietly asking me to disappear to keep it intact. At some point, I stopped asking whether silence was helping. I started asking what it was protecting me from, and what it was quietly taking instead. That question didn't arrive suddenly. It formed slowly, in moments when I felt strangely detached from my own reactions, as if I were watching myself from a distance, rather than living inside the moment. I began to notice how often I chose calm over clarity, how quickly I dismissed the urge to speak as unnecessary or inconvenient. I told myself that my feelings didn't need to be named to be real. But the truth was harder to ignore. Unnamed feelings don't disappear. They linger, waiting for somewhere to go. There were interactions that ended without conflict, without resolution, without any visible sign of damage. Yet afterward, something stayed with me. A heaviness. A sense that something important had been postponed indefinitely. Peace had kept everything intact on the surface, but underneath, things remained unfinished. I realized how much of my energy went into containment. Not processing, not understanding, containing. I carried emotions quietly, careful not to let them spill into the space between me and others. That restraint was praised as maturity, but it left me feeling oddly disconnected from my own experience. There were moments when I felt resentment surface, not sharp, not outward, but dull and persistent. Resentment for always being the one who adjusted, for swallowing words so that others wouldn't have to sit with discomfort. That resentment didn't turn into anger. It settled into fatigue, into the kind of tiredness that comes from constant self-editing. I began to understand that peace, when maintained through silence, is not shared. It is carried. And carrying it alone slowly reshapes you, You become careful. You become measured. You become less present, even when you're fully there. What unsettled me most was how familiar this pattern felt. How natural it had become to step back instead of forward. Silence no longer felt like a choice I made. It felt like a role I performed, one that kept everything predictable, manageable, calm. There were moments when the quiet felt almost loud, not because it demanded attention, but because it reflected back everything I hadn't allowed myself to say. In those moments, I could feel the weight of what had been swallowed, not as regret, but as absence. Something that should have moved outward, but never did. I started to question who this piece was really for, whether anyone had actually asked me to carry so much on my own, whether the calm I was preserving would survive if I stopped disappearing inside it. Those questions didn't demand immediate answers, but they refused to stay quiet. By then, silence no longer felt like wisdom. It felt like a compromise I had outgrown. I could sense the edge of it, the point where restraint would stop being care and start becoming loss. Nothing had changed yet on the outside, but inside, something was preparing to shift, not through force, not through confrontation, but through a quiet refusal to keep paying the same cost. I didn't arrive at this realization through confrontation or courage. There was no moment of speaking up, no dramatic shift, no sudden clarity. What changed was quieter than that. I began to notice the cost of swallowing my words not as something abstract, but as something lived, in the way I felt less present, less whole, even when everything around me seemed calm. Peace, I learned, is not always the absence of conflict. Sometimes it is simply the absence of someone fully existing inside the room. There is a difference between choosing silence and disappearing inside it, between restraint that protects and restraint that erases. Strength does not come from how much you can endure without speaking. It comes from knowing when your presence matters enough to be felt, not loudly, not forcefully, just honestly. Peace that asks you to become smaller is not peace you owe anyone. And recognizing that doesn't make you difficult or disruptive. It makes you aware. If you stayed with this story until the end, thank you. Some stories aren't meant to teach you what to do next. They exist to remind you of something you already know, but haven't allowed yourself to acknowledge yet. If parts of this felt familiar, let that recognition stay with you. There are more stories like this coming. Quiet, honest, and unafraid to sit with what usually goes unsaid. If you return for the next one, we'll continue from here, not chasing peace at any cost, but listening closely to what it's been asking us to give up.